uh, time to get this show on the road. Hello and welcome to this installment of II's webinar series. Today we are looking at a new angle of entrepreneurialism and entrepreneurship, and particularly how it might fit into the COVID-19 crisis we are currently experiencing. My name is Kevin Gomez. I'm the program manager at the Institute for Economic Inquiry, where we aim to have robust discussions across Creighton University's campus and abroad about markets and how economic freedom affects human flourishing. Today's talk fits right into this mission, where we can further dive into economic and social outcomes of from the perspective of economics, ethics, and of course, entrepreneurship. For today's presentation, please feel free to ask questions throughout via the Q&A tab in the Zoom toolbar, either on the top or the bottom of your screen. At the halfway point or so, we will be opening up for Q&A, so feel free to let me know if you'd like to voice your question, and I will open up the mic for you. Our guest today is Adam Thierer, who is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he specializes in innovation, entrepreneurialism, internet, and free speech issues, with a particular focus on public policy concerns surrounding emerging technologies. Thierer has authored and edited several books, including his foundational book, which had an incredible impact on my worldview several years ago, on the freedom to innovate, titled Permissionless Innovation, the continuing case for comprehensive technological freedom. His work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, the Washington Post, The Atlantic, and Forbes, among others, and he has appeared on national television numerous times. Today, he's going to be discussing his newest book, Evasive Entrepreneurs and the Future of Governance, How Innovation Improves Economies and Governments. He'll make the case that we should accept and often embrace a certain amount of disruptive entrepreneurship that fosters innovation and drives economic growth, and keeps government accountable to the governed. So previously, Thierer was president of the Progress and Freedom Foundation, director of telecommunications studies at the Cato Institute, and a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He received his MA in International Business Management and Trade Theory at the University of Maryland, and his BA in Journalism and Political Philosophy at Indiana University. Adam, thank you so much for joining us today. And without further ado, I'll let you go on with it.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thanks to all of you who are joining us today for the discussion. I look forward to interacting with you and having some questions from you as the conversation goes on. So, as Kevin alluded to, I wrote a book a few years back called Permissionless Innovation, and I published that in 2016, the second edition of it at least. And following the publication of that book, I was out on the road doing a lot of talks, and I was at law schools, philosophy programs, econ programs, business schools, or just doing public policy events with other nonprofits. And inevitably, after doing a little show about permissionless innovation, someone would walk up to me and say, "Hey, have you heard about this? Have you heard about this interesting thing that's happened, or that interesting thing?" And one by one, I started documenting these things, some of which I had heard of, but many I had not. And I started compiling these interesting examples of essentially people putting permissionless innovation into action in unique ways. And I'll never forget the day where I decided, well, I need to have a sequel to Permissionless Innovation, write a whole new book, because I was lecturing at a school up north, and a student came up to me who I wish I would have gotten his name because he inspired me to finally make the decision to write the book. But he came up and asked me, "Have you ever heard of pothole vigilantes?" And I said, "Excuse me, pothole vigilantes? What's that?" And he says, "Well, these are people that will go out in their community, work together, and go out late at night and actually fill potholes when governments fail to, patch up roads in their own neighborhood. And sometimes they'll even do it artistically. They'll fill them in nicely, and then they'll paint over them some sort of a mural or something." And I said, "Well, that's really intriguing. I hadn't heard much about that." He mentioned it. I went and looked it up, and then shortly thereafter, the Wall Street Journal ran a front page article about pothole vigilantes. I'm like, wow, that's crazy. This is actually happening. And yet nobody was talking about the fact that it was kind of crazy, and it was also kind of illegal. And I thought to myself, well, that would make it really interesting to discuss in the context of permissionless innovation, but there's something more going on here there's some sort of evasive activity happening. And for lack of a better phrase, I like to use the word or the phrase evasive entrepreneurialism to describe this. And so I started documenting examples of evasive entrepreneurialism in action. And they eventually became a long essay, which then became a long book chapter, which then became chapter 2 of my new book on evasive entrepreneurs and the future of governance. And so in chapter 2 of the book and throughout the whole text, I document examples from all sorts of different fields of entrepreneurialism, not just commercial, but as the pothole vigilante example gives us an insight to, sort of bottom-up household variants of sort of social entrepreneurialism or household innovation, as some scholars call it. And the range of evasive entrepreneurialism just runs the gamut with all sorts of small and large examples. The biggest, most paradigmatic example of evasive entrepreneurialism over the past decade probably has been the case of the sharing economy, and specifically ride sharing with Uber and Lyft, which of course has a lot of controversy surrounding it about how they engaged in that evasive entrepreneurialism. But it nonetheless was a real game changer. And I think for a lot of people like myself who spent 30 years covering the law and economics of regulation in particular, it's an amazing story, because for the better part of, I would say, about 7 decades, economists and political scientists had been making the case for reform of taxi cab laws and other types of transportation regulations, specifically at the municipal level. And we have amassed a massive body of economic and legal research and evidence that shows that it's essentially an anti-consumer fiasco that undermines consumer welfare, undermines choice and competition, raises prices, decreases quality. When you think about what really matters and why we regulate, it comes down to 3 variables: price, quality, and quantity. And all 3 of those variables, regulation has failed us. And we pointed this out. And it wasn't just free market economists and lawyers and policy wonks saying this. It was the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission had report after report saying this, even looking into state and local fiascos in this regard. And people on the left had documented this as well, many left-leaning scholars and economists. And this was also true for things like occupational license reform and many other things I have mentioned in the book. But the ride-sharing example was particularly interesting because despite 7 decades worth of all of that wonderful evidence, again, bipartisan, nonpartisan, we got nowhere. We never got any serious reforms through, right? This was an amazing failure in the world of ideas. We had consensus. This should have been a slam dunk. And then along came 2010 and Uber and Lyft, and the whole world changed like that, just overnight. All of a sudden, choices were available. Competition was around us. We were tasting these waters of freedom, and we didn't want to go back. The policy dynamic, the regulatory dynamic fundamentally changed at that moment. And so all of a sudden, policymakers and regulators who were in cahoots all too often with taxi cab owners or medallion owners or license owners, basically they didn't no longer have the upper hand. And we were able to overcome these public choice problems through evasive entrepreneurialism. What did Uber and Lyft in particular do? They made policy change part of their business model. They set out to actually do an end run, if you will, around the system because the system was so fundamentally broken beyond repair. They did it and it worked. And what's so amazing about this story, despite the fact that in many ways Uber has become a bit of a pariah in recent years and there's been problems still, but we do enjoy choices we've never had before. But what's really amazing about this story is that Uber and Lyft and other disruptive innovators like this or evasive entrepreneurs had very few defenders ex ante, but almost everyone defends them ex post. And when I go to like law schools or philosophy programs, I have wonderful fun with this sort of morality of this question. I'll ask the students, I say, who here has recently stayed in an Airbnb or taken an Uber or Lyft? Just a show of hands. And almost every hand goes up, especially if I'm in a large urban area. And I said, well, then what's wrong with you all? You're all lawbreakers. Didn't you know that this is technically against the law, what they're doing? Now, again, these days it's not, but there was a time when it was. And I said, well, how do you justify this? And are you defending these companies for doing this, behaving evasively, if you will? And they really struggled with answering that question. And it gets to this, this paradox, or this interesting fact that it's so easy to defend entrepreneurialism after it's been successful. But it's very, very hard for people to do it beforehand or while it's actually happening. What I set down to do in my book is to provide an empirical accounting of what's happening on the ground, to say, this is why evasive entrepreneurialism is on the rise. But then to go a step further and to make the normative case for why it's a good thing. And it's a good thing not just because of what it means for consumers and prosperity and progress and human flourishing. It's a good thing for government. It's a good thing for government when entrepreneurs challenge broken, archaic, old systems, because all too often we have failed to take steps to reform those systems when they undermine common sense or the consent of the government. And in this sense, I talk about innovation and entrepreneurialism as almost like a relief valve, a check, a new type of check and balance, if you will, on inefficient, misguided government. Now, that will be controversial to some, but it really shouldn't be. Because as Deirdre McCloskey and many other scholars of innovation have taught us, throughout history, innovation has been considered a form of heresy by some. Innovation and technological change has always disrupted some subtle norms, many of them which are legal in nature. And that has a way of really antagonizing people. This is why creative destruction is so controversial and so hard and has so many enemies. My favorite books on these topics that I always mention are Virginia Prostel's The Future and Its Enemies and Castellucci-Juma's Innovation and Its Enemies, Why People Resist New Technologies, which are replete with amazing histories of what I just documented, what I just discussed in terms of why people oppose technological change. And in the past, policymakers and special interests were often able to work together to stop technological change using a variety of political and regulatory barriers to entry and competition. The amazing thing about innovation circa 2020 is that technology, because it's grown so much more powerful, so decentralized, distributed, often much cheaper as well, has empowered people to take matters into their own hands and challenge old broken policy systems. Political systems and policies. And that is a game changer. It is fundamentally altering the nature of public policy debates around regulation. And again, I think for the better. This is, in fact, the only reason I have any sort of optimism about the possibility of deregulation is not because I think we get deregulation anymore through traditional mechanisms. In my own lifetime, I'd have to go back to my childhood in the 1970s to even think about a time when federal lawmakers sat down and seriously deregulated any industry or sector or got rid of any agency. It just doesn't happen anymore. The public choice dynamics essentially prevent it everywhere. But technological change is altering that dynamic. What I argue in the book is essentially what evasive entrepreneurs are out to do is not completely evade all laws. This isn't some sort of like a narco-capitalist fantasy. Rather, they're out to change the political dynamic and gain some leverage in policy discussions about technological change. And technology, the more distributed, decentralized, ubiquitous, and inexpensive that it becomes, enables us to change these dynamics for the better. So what are some of the other examples I talk about in the book? It's not just the sharing economy. I go, again, that's sort of the paradigmatic story, and I spend some real time on it discussing that. You think about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. Much has been written about how they're shaking things up in many different contexts. You think about food entrepreneurialism. You think about all the interesting things people are doing in their homes or in food trucks or with food distribution to change the way food policies and regulations should work. Amazing stuff there. You think about medical devices, and I spent a lot of time talking about more types of personalized medicine and the way that our smartphones have become essentially mobile medical devices. And I talk about the amazing stories about how regulators are struggling to figure out what do we do with all the health and fitness apps that are flying into the app stores and giving people new information about themselves and their bodies. Again, that's a form of evasive entrepreneurialism. Essentially, in the past, everything that was done that's now in an app store regarding health and fitness trackers would have been illegal, technically illegal. What about 3D printers? I spent a lot of time on 3D printers talking about all interesting things people are making. Most amazing experience I've had in the last 10 years here at Mercatus was a talk I gave at George Hopkins University Hospital when a group of volunteers got together, brought their 3D printers and open source blueprints, and on the spot made for families with children with limb deficiencies, they made them new hands and arms to the specifications of the children. Children would one up and say, I want a Wolverine claw for a hand. I want an Iron Man hand. They would fabricate them on the spot, colored just like the comic book heroes, and the kids 30 minutes later would have a new hand or arm that would have them beaming with smiles. I was so emotional that day, but I got to debate an FDA doctor at that conference. And I asked the doctor, I said, there's been amazing things happening in this conference center during this weekend, but I have to ask, isn't this all illegal? I mean, they're making medical devices, right? Doesn't FDA law prohibit this? Isn't everybody in this auditorium a criminal? And boy, everybody really perked up all of a sudden, like, I'm a criminal, what? And the FDA doctor actually said, no, we haven't made this illegal or anything like that yet. And he said, yet? When are you going to make it illegal? It's a very long story, but to make it shorter, the FDA later decided not to make it illegal, but to their credit came out with guidance about sort of best practices for developing 3D printed prosthetics. It's part of what I talk about in the book about how regulatory agencies are having to respond to evasive entrepreneurialism using forms of what I refer to as soft law. And soft law is basically just, well, the opposite of hard law. It's not promulgated regulations and laws governing technological change. Rather, it's sort of like soft guidelines or best practices or sort of multi-stakeholder proceedings where people get together and talk about like how to better govern technology without laws and regulations. It's a really interesting development. I won't go into it in depth unless people want to talk about it, but I've written entire law review articles about it, and I have 2 chapters in the book talking about the rise of soft law as an alternative governance scheme for technological change. But what other examples do I talk about? Well, I talk about interesting things happening in the world of aviation, where it's much, much harder to get things done, and in the field of transportation more generally, housing, energy sector, so on and so forth. These are the sectors that are actually hardest for evasive entrepreneurialism to take root because of a problem that I refer to as the born captive versus born free problem. A lot of technologies, specifically a lot of digital technologies and modern information technologies, are blessed to be born free. They're born into an environment that is mostly characterized by freedom to innovate, where we have an innovator's presumption of innocent until proven guilty. But unfortunately, in some of the sectors and areas where we most need technological change, transportation, housing, energy, healthcare, technologies in those sectors are born into regulatory captivity, if you will. As soon as they come about, the innovators are confronted with regulators at the federal, state, and local level who say like, well, what is this new thing called a drone? It's really just a flying thing, right? We'll regulate it like an airplane or at least a model aircraft. And we've got regulations for that. Oh, what is this thing called Bitcoin and cryptocurrency? It's just another form of money, right? Well, we've got all sorts of regulations for money. And so it's a square peg round hole problem very quickly in an attempt to pigeonhole new technologies into yesterday's broken regulatory regimes ends up really undermining the innovative capacity of our nation. And this is where we're faced with a real serious problem. Because will innovators behave evasively, even though it's much, much more likely they'll get nailed for it in those sectors? Or will they just leave? And if they leave, they can leave domestically and maybe go state to state to find more freedom, or they can just leave the country entirely. This is what I discuss in the book at length, the sort of rise of innovation arbitrage. And a natural byproduct of a world with more technological decentralization and empowerment and evasive entrepreneurialism is a little bit of voting with your feet. And I document case after case of this happening, both here domestically, state to state, with things like driverless cars. And then I also document it internationally with things like drones, where America has really, really hurt our drone innovators. And you see things like people doing blood delivery by drone in sub-Saharan Africa or in like remote Pacific islands. And yet, if you put a drone, a foot off the air in the United States, you get nailed for it. You get regulated by the FAA immediately and have to go through a whole permissioning system of mother may I permits before you can innovate. And so what our innovators are confronted with is this collision, this sort of conflict of visions or regulatory paradigms, born free versus born in captivity. And the really interesting thing about so many of the technologies I document in the book is that they sort of meld these two worlds and they put them on a collision course. I mean, everything in a smartphone today, I can identify, and I do in the book, 20 different previous technologies or applications that I used to have to buy separately and store in my backpack or my pocket or my house or my car, that now are all in this one device. But a huge number of them are regulated, right? But it doesn't make any difference. We've got freedom for those things now through this device because they all came together in this sort of one digital Swiss Army knife, if you will. That's a game changer, right? But that doesn't work for something like supersonic transportation. That doesn't work for big alternative energy projects and plans. That doesn't necessarily even work for cryptocurrencies, which are increasingly finding themselves subject to a lot of regulatory threats. Anyway, I document all of these and more examples in the book and try to figure out a framework for going forward, how we might be able to defend more evasive entrepreneurialism when laws don't change. I identify why laws are not likely to change, but I also advocate continuing to try to go through the system to effectuate positive change for technological freedom. But I'm just not very optimistic. I've spent 30 years in the field, haven't gotten very far, a lot of failures, few successes. Even things people count as a success that I've been involved in, like the Telecommunications Act of 1996, wasn't really much deregulation. Instead, it was hundreds of pages of new, different regulation with a little bit of deregulation at the margins. What really changed things in the mid-1990s was essentially benign neglect. The internet's not even mentioned really, just barely. It's an afterthought in the Telecommunications Act. We kind of forgot about it, thankfully, right? And think of the wonderful things that have happened. But then the Clinton administration did something really important. They also declared a new policy vision for the internet and electronic commerce that was one that generally embraced more permissionless innovation and said, we're going to give innovators the green light. And so in the book, I document a number of ways we can take that sort of same internet permissionless innovation approach as a policy prerogative and sort of put it into action. I talk about things like the Innovators Presumption, which we would basically say, let's write into every technology policy the presumption that any innovator in innovation is innocent until proven guilty, and that the burden of proof for resisting that new technology or stopping it lies with the opponents of change or the agencies to prove. But the presumption should be, give them the green light. And then I talk about things like the sunsetting imperative, like how we need to get serious about cleaning up archaic old regulations and rules that hold back innovative dynamism. And in that context, we need to be writing into law, either in existing laws or new laws, a requirement that every 2 years, basically about the same timetable as Moore's Law, we sunset rules and regulations governing technologies. You want to put them back on the books, fine. Let's have another debate about that. But don't engage in set it and forget it, build and freeze government. That's the fundamental problem for innovators today. They're confronted with reams of regulations that have accumulated through the years and just never been cleaned up. We never have a thorough spring cleaning of the regulatory state. And as my colleagues at the Mercatus Center and others have documented endlessly, regulatory accumulation is an innovation killer. We have to do something about it. If we have time later, I'll be happy to discuss a new paper I've done with my colleagues proposing a sort of BRAC commission-like model for reforming laws and regulations sunset during the COVID crisis. And we call it the Fresh Start Initiative. And we have a proposal for doing it at the federal level and the state level. And we think it's going to attract some real bipartisan support. But short of things like that happening, we want to make sure innovation continues to happen. And maybe this is where I'll transition to some questions with you, Kevin, and some discussion with our listeners. We need to think about, in the wake of the COVID crisis, all of the rules and the regulations that have been identified by governments themselves that have held back positive responses that could have helped in the midst of one of the greatest public health crises in our lifetimes. It is astonishing to me that hundreds upon hundreds of rules and regulations have either been abandoned or temporarily suspended in the wake of this crisis when they were put in place to supposedly help public health. If they're not helping and government themselves say they need to be paused during a crisis, then what are they good for? This is when they should be most needed, right? So governments themselves have essentially given us the evidence we needed. We already had the evidence, right? All the economists and lawyers and policy wonks working on this. We said, this is why you need to reform con laws, certificate of need laws. This is why you need to reform occupational licensing. This is why these FDA and CDC regulations need to be reformed or sunset, and so on and so forth. We got nowhere. We got nowhere. Evasive entrepreneurialism and technological civil disobedience, as I call it, sometimes pushes at the margins of legal norms and forces that change because regulators have no choice or they're going to become irrelevant. But hopefully now, my greatest hope is in the wake of the COVID crisis, we do get serious about a legitimate legislative and regulatory spring cleaning, that we do address regulatory accumulation, that we do realign laws and regulations with common sense and the consent of the government. I hope that's the case. I don't know if it'll happen, but my book points toward that direction and says if it doesn't, you can expect even more evasive entrepreneurialism in coming months and years. And if it does, I'll be here to cheer it on. So Kevin, let me turn it back to you and see if you have some questions or if maybe we have some audience questions.
Thanks for that. That was fantastic, and a great overview of your new book. So we do have one question from Dr. Deanna Thomas, and I'll just read it out to you here. So she goes, you mentioned the example of prosthetics and how the FDA responded to 3D printers by issuing guidelines for prosthetics printing. She's wondering whether the difference between guidelines versus regulatory rules is really that significant. She agrees that at the margin, guidelines might be easier to change and update, but I also think that given existing legal institutions, the effects of guidelines issued by regulatory agencies is pretty much exactly the same as a regulatory change. So any hospital not conforming with FDA mask guidelines right now exposes themselves to legal liability that essentially makes these guidelines as restrictive as more formal regulatory rules. So kind of your thoughts on that.
That's a great question from Dr. Thomas, and thank you for it. I should mention that Dr. Thomas's work is something I cite repeatedly in my work, and so it's great to get the question from her. I think this is a really fair point, a really important point. This question about guidances, I mean, we can look at it from an economic perspective, from a poli-sci perspective, a legal perspective. I get a lot of challenges about sort of soft law and informal guidance efforts because many conservatives and libertarian types, including myself, spent many, many decades fighting against arbitrary governance and the growth of the administrative state in particular. And there's a real danger when regulators do things sort of like outside the book. You know, they don't do things by the book, they do it outside it, because that can lead to arbitrary, unaccountable, unconstitutional forms of governance that really constitute an abuse of power. This sort of abuse of power was so prominent in the field that I cut my teeth in of communications law that we used to refer to this as, in the FCC context, as regulation by raised eyebrow, which is that when regulators wanted to do an end run around the First Amendment and force a sort of informal censorship of media companies like broadcasters, they used to just sort of harangue them and call them in and say, what are you going to put on the air tonight? You know, that kind of thing. That's not what we want. That's not optimal. Now, let me turn back to the question of things like FDA guidance and modern guidance documents or best practices or agency workshops and multi-stakeholder processes or this sort of broad amalgam of different governance mechanisms I refer to as soft law, and tell you why they're a little bit different. They're a little bit different because the agencies no longer have time on their side. The fundamental reality is all of the emerging technologies we're talking about, and even some of the older technologies, are increasingly characterized by the sort of pacing problem issue. Pacing problem refers to the fact that technological change is at least linear and sometimes exponential, but policy change is sort of like more incremental, and the gap between them is growing every year. In the old days, regulators could sit around and say, well, what is this new technology? What is this thing? You know, let's ponder it. Let's have a notice of proposed rulemaking and a notice of inquiry, and let's take many years to study this matter. And they could get away with that. These days, they can't. They can in some contexts. And if they do, however, there's going to be ramifications. I talked about innovation arbitrage. And that really does weigh on the minds of a lot of policymakers and regulators. But more than anything else, regulators just want to be relevant. They want to be heard. And in many, many cases, what the FDA wants is not necessarily an ironclad rule that constrains all innovation. They just want to consult with the people who are doing the innovation. Again, this can be abused. I don't mean to be an apologist for this regime. But it does raise this interesting question. If by consulting with regulators and having sort of amorphous best practices and codes of conduct or sort of workshop guidelines or whatever issued or just discussed, if that opens the door to more innovation in that sector, more freedom to innovate, Is that a win for freedom? Is it the best we can get? Now, that's a pragmatic question, because I know a lot of people push back and say, no, dang it, we need to deregulate the FDA. Many call for its abolition. I do not call for the abolition of the FDA, but more practically speaking, it ain't going to happen. It is not going to happen. So we have to have a backup plan. We have to think through what our approach will be to gaining wins, even maybe just marginal ones, for innovation freedom in the hardest areas to effectuate positive change for freedom and deregulation. FDA, FAA, FCC, and a whole another alphabet soup of other three-letter agencies at the federal level. If they're going to be there, can we basically sort of keep them occupied or give them something to do without it being a permission slip approach? What I would argue is that, amazingly, that's happening because of evasive entrepreneurialism, technological change. That, again, the political dynamic has changed fundamentally within these agencies, and that they recognize that they're sort of up against a sort of hidden clock. If we don't do something here soon to make ourselves heard and have some input, we'll just be left behind. Now, of course, they can basically just bring down the sledgehammer and say, no, we're shutting down this field entirely. I spent a lot of time in the book talking about the case study of 23andMe. The FDA said, you should come talk to us. You should come talk to us. We want to talk about genetic testing by mail. They didn't. 23andMe tried to be evasive entrepreneurs. They tried to engage in a little permissionless innovation. And then they got a cease and desist notice in the mail. And then their whole system was off the market for like 18 months. And all of that wonderful stuff they were doing had to be taken down, retooled, seek a permission slip, and they started over from scratch with a much more narrowly focused genetic test by mail. That's really unfortunate. But it's also more the exception to the rule in most of the case studies I go through in the book. Most of them look something more akin to what's happened with Uber or Airbnb and sharing economy innovation. Again, the regulators do push back. I talk about this in Star Wars terms. I say, usually we have like a Star Wars New Hope moment with innovators coming in, and then the Empire strikes back. But then the really interesting question is, what's the return of the Jedi moment look like, right? Do we find some sort of balance in the Force? Not always. But the reason I'm optimistic is because technology has been such a game changer. Not everywhere, not always, but in most cases it has, especially with the door being open to interesting forms of innovation arbitrage. And again, that can happen domestically. The case study I have in the book about driverless cars is so interesting. The way that driverless cars, states and localities have tried to regulate them in very interesting ways. The federal government has left a complete policy vacuum on that front. We're now 6-7 years into debates about having federal driverless car legislation. I have ongoing bets with all of my economist friends around the building every year that legislation will never pass. Every year I collect money. Every year, without fail. They're like, this is a slam dunk. Everybody believes we need federal legislation on driverless cars and like setting simple rules of the road. I'm like, yeah, we probably do. We're not going to get it. Instead, it's all booted to the states and even localities. And then innovation arbitrage kicking in. When San Francisco started mucking around with Uber and said, we're going to regulate these driverless cars you put on the road, immediately Governor Ducey in Arizona put out a tweet that said, hey, Uber, here we are. Come down here and innovate. You can drive on our roads. And that's what happened. That also happened in Nevada. It happened in Ohio. It happened in many other contexts I document in the book. Innovation is a relief valve. Again, a way to sort of escape the old regulatory hell. And that is a game changer. And the reason why I think we're going to continue to see these sort of informal modes of governance, soft law, guidances, best practices, and that they won't be command and control, that they won't be entirely permission slip based. In fact, they can't be. They can't be strict permission slip based if the agency is not promulgating formal regulation. Because if they try to insert a permission slip into informal guidance, that makes it actionable in court. And then our friends at Institute for Justice and Goldwater and Pacific and elsewhere, they kick into gear and they defend their rights in courts. But the agencies know that. And they don't want to be in court any more than anybody else does, because there's a good chance to lose, and there's a good chance they'll just waste a lot of money in the process. So hopefully that answers Dr. Thomas's question, but there's many different moving pieces to that question, but it's an essential one.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome. When it comes to kind of this compliance paradox that you discuss in the book, we can think of COVID-19 as kind of putting that on hyperspeed, that compliance paradox coming up in hyperspeed. What are some ways you think that evasive entrepreneurs are taking on the rigidities that come with C-19 lockdowns and health crises. Do you have any kind of examples that we've seen? I know what we've seen the regulatory regime kind of become lax on a number of different regulations, but how are entrepreneurs kind of pushing that? And what are some of the examples that they've been kind of diving into?
Sure, great question. Well, as I alluded to, in the wake of COVID pandemic outbreak, we've seen all these interesting examples of what we might refer to as sort of partial deregulations or informal deregulations in the form of suspensions, rule suspensions, or temporary sunsets of some sort. It's not really clear how these rules will come back on the book, and I can talk more about that in a moment. And maybe we have this chance now, as I alluded to like clean them up while they're off the books. Especially there's a new executive order, White House executive order on this, and some other reforms are being proposed in Congress along these lines. But in the wake of the outbreak, we saw a sudden wave of evasive entrepreneurialism from all different quarters. I mean, sometimes it was in just mundane things that are still regulated. I'll give you two examples that I talk about in a new afterword to the book that I was able to sneak in just before publication, and that I talk about in other essays. Hand sanitizers and face masks. These things are regulated medical devices or health products. And there are reams of regulations governing something as simple as an alcohol and gel cocktail known as hand sanitizer. There are rules and regulations governing face masks. And I understand there's actually some good standards out there for like, okay, this face mask works better than something else. But a lot of people are like, look, I just want some sort of a facial covering. Why do I need to wait for an officially regulated one? And so they took matters in their own hands. They pulled out their sewing machines or their 3D printers. They started making them. And then a lot of distillers and other people said, I can make hand sanitizer. I've got alcohol on premises. And they started making it. Sure enough, they ran into regulations. The distillers ran into regulations governing whether or not they were using denatured alcohol. As if we're going to have kids chugging bottles of hand sanitizer. I mean, just insanity. But that's the way the regulatory system sometimes works. But that just scratches the surface. There were all sorts of doctors and other people putting out calls to people with 3D printers to help them make ventilator parts or to convert old breathing machines into full functional multi-purpose ventilators. And people responded. And on the fly, we had sort of evasive entrepreneurialism in action, and the FDA sort of just had to cobble together some guidelines and say, okay, this is okay, but try to do it this way. But they didn't stop it outright. There are many, many other examples I talk about in my recent essays on this. But what's astonishing about these rules is that the regulators themselves, as I mentioned earlier, are the ones acknowledging that they're problematic. And I think the compliance paradox that you alluded to, Kevin, is really crucial here, because the compliance paradox, quite obvious, refers to the fact that if you just crack down, if you double down on really hard-nosed regulations, command and control edicts, and you just keep saying no, 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 well, at some point, people just start ignoring this, and you can't really enforce these rules anymore, or innovation arbitrage kicks in, or whatever else. At some point, regulators themselves acknowledge that fact. And they know they have to be more accommodating, but they won't be so accommodating as to say, we're just going to give up entirely. Again, they want to be heard. And so striking that balance going forward is a really tricky thing in the post-COVID world. I'll just mention again a plug for what my colleagues and I at Mercatus have proposed. It's not the only idea, but we're working in conjunction with several other nonprofit organizations, with several lawmakers and other people, to try to find a way to create an institutional design mechanism to address in a formal way these rules and regulations that have been suspended in the wake of the COVID outbreak. And this idea of the Fresh Start initiative that I mentioned would basically be a BRAC-like commission. BRAC refers to the old Base Realignment and Closure Commission that was set up in the Cold War era, at the end of the Cold War, to deal with the fact that we had all these military bases and congressional districts that needed to go. They just weren't needed anymore after the Cold War. And yet not a single Congress critter was ever going to vote against his own, military base. It's a pork barrel. It's a gravy train. You don't want to give up something like that because it's a way to funnel money back to your district. So the public choice dynamic had to be addressed. And in one of the most brilliant institutional design mechanism decisions of all time, the BRAC Commission reform model was born. And we basically came up with the idea of saying, let's bring together an expert group to study all of these bases, have a study that says, what makes sense, what doesn't in terms of existing bases, and then put together a reform package that has a one-time conspicuous thumbs up or thumbs down vote on the entire package. The crucial thing about that design is that it gave the lawmakers who didn't want to vote against their own district a sort of get out of jail free card with their people back home. They could say, look, I didn't want this. I didn't want my base to be, gutted. I didn't want to see it go. But man, they gave me this choice of 50 other bases, and ours was one of them. And I am really sorry all these people voted against our base, because I would have voted to preserve it. But at the end of the day, that lawmaker still voted for that package. Can we apply that same model to rules and regulations that have been suspended in the wake of COVID? Now, it's a little bit trickier because you're dealing with federal and state rules. And frankly, the most problematic rules, I think, that we've found in the wake of COVID, you could make an argument it's FDA and CDC regs, but they've been a little bit more flexible. I think the real problem is at the state level. And I think specifically it's for things like certificate of need laws and occupational licensing regs, where again, we've got reams of evidence. Dr. Thomas was just asking the question. She's done great work on this, along with many others. I think that's the area where we're going to need sort of a state level reform model based upon like a BRAC thing, where the states come up with this, because the feds just can't take all those rules and put them together and say, they've all got to go. You can't do that in a federalist structure like ours. So we're going to need groups like your own and others at the state level to come up with reform models like this that go beyond just the occupational licensing reform or con law reform efforts we've had in the past to incorporate other things. But those two areas would be our target areas. And if we can bring them together in one reform package and have a conspicuous vote at the state legislatures that says up or down on that, I don't know if it'll work, but I think it offers us some of our best opportunities in a long, long time to see positive change in this context, when we've been struggling for years to get any sort of traction on these rules. Again, despite nonpartisan agreement on it, right? I mean, the Obama White House had an amazing report on occupational license, incredible. And there's plenty of other people on the left that have supported reform of occupational licensing and con laws. Again, should be a slam dunk, but it isn't. Sometimes, I hate to say it, it takes a crisis to get change. And I think hopefully that's the silver lining of the COVID crisis, positive change to archaic, crusty old rules and regulations that undermine public welfare and health.
Awesome. So we have another question from Dr. Colin O'Reilly, and he asks, do you make a distinction between evasive entrepreneurship that is costly to engage in, where you have to evade to produce, versus evasive entrepreneurship that does not have the additional costs? You innovated for the sake of innovating and winds up being evasive. Do you make that distinction, and where's that threshold?
In the book, I have a section on the many flavors of entrepreneurialism. And in the literature, there's really interesting discussions about evasive entrepreneurialism. And then there's productive versus unproductive entrepreneurialism. Then there's productive, unproductive entrepreneurialism. And there's so many variants you can go through. And there's a lot of literature in the post 9/11 period about like TSA regulations being very inefficient, but then yet creating new types of entrepreneurialism and new things. And it's like, I could go through all of that. It's kind of the literature is kind of a mess, but what's even crazier about it is that you then have to layer in a lot of literature, which actually emanates from the left, about bottom-up household non-commercial innovation. And a big part of the evasive entrepreneurialism story is the story of that sort of entrepreneurialism or social entrepreneurialism taking root. Eric von Hippel has written a lot of stuff on this at MIT, but there's been many other scholars on the left, Andrew Torrance and others, who basically make a very, very strong case for sort of forms of evasive entrepreneurialism, productive entrepreneurialism, in a non-commercial, decentralized household context. But boy, as soon as somebody wants to charge a penny for it, they're like, well, I don't know if you've got the freedom to innovate then. It's like money sullies everything or something. So there's that distinction. And that's a crazy one. I get into the morality of that. And I talk about how that just doesn't work anymore. I give the example of drones and wedding photography. Wedding photography has always been a thing, but drones are now a big, big part of the wedding photography business. A lot of brides and grooms want a drone flown above to take an aerial shot of the entire wedding party. And so a lot of people who do drone wedding photography are offering that service as part of the thing that they charge a fee for. Of course, that's regulated by the FAA, and you have to get special permits and licenses. Now, what's interesting is that if your drunk uncle shows up at your wedding and pulls a drone out of his trunk and throws, I'll just throw this in the air and I'll take a picture, y'all. It's like a different regulatory regime. And, that's kind of nuts. And I talk about that crazy morality question about like non-commercial versus commercial, and how in some cases it's not even clear what commercial versus non-commercial is. What if I have a Kickstarter to do some sort of new cryptocurrency 3D printed prosthetic business? And I say, just give me voluntary contributions to help kids with limb deficiencies. Is that a commercial or non-commercial business? I don't know. I'm getting money, but maybe it's voluntary nonprofit, So I do get into these distinctions. They're in chapters 2 and 3 of the book. And I talk about them both from an economic perspective, but I spend more time talking about it from a legalistic or morality perspective, because of the number of people who will talk about the importance of the freedom to innovate in a non-commercial, decentralized, open source context or household context. But then their paradigm totally falls apart when it becomes more along the lines of traditional commercial entrepreneurialism. And I argue that that doesn't work anymore in an age of widespread technological diffusion and unique business models for people to be entrepreneurial, which are often very fluid and shift from being non-commercial or nonprofit to for-profit commercial, and then maybe back. So interesting model. I'll give you one other quick example. There's a character I talk about in the book named Amos Dudley, who was a teenager. As a teenager, he was mad because his mom wanted to get him Invisalign, but she couldn't afford it. And he got very mad, and he was a very smart kid. And it's sort of stick it to the man moment, and really more stick it to the man being the company that made Invisalign and not the FDA. He said, well, the hell with this. I can go down to my high school shop, which has a 3D printer, and I can print my own brace work. And he did it. And he put his blueprints for how he did it online with pictures of how he did it over time and constantly reworking his brace work. He was 18, I think, when he started this. He later got a nice scholarship at college, I think partially based on the fact that he opened up his blueprints to the world and showed everybody how to do it. But when his friends came knocking, or rather probably emailing or texting, and said, hey, can you help me do this? Because my mom can't afford Invisalign either. He said, I don't want any part of this. He wisely stepped back and said, I don't want to get in trouble. But he gave the information to the world freely. Is Amos Dudley liable for that? Is that evasive entrepreneurialism? I think it is. It's not commercial entrepreneurialism. I think it's a very productive form of entrepreneurialism, one that a lot of orthodontists didn't take kindly to, I will tell you, and wanted to see regulated. But how do you regulate it? He didn't sell anything. So again, the economic questions are interesting, but the legal questions are terrifically interesting. So in chapter 4 of the book, I talk about the ethics of these things, these different forms of entrepreneurialism. And I make the argument that the approach that a lot of people on the left and in the regulatory community take, the binary approach of commercial versus non-commercial, that just is falling apart very, very quickly. They need to come up with a different sort of harms-based model saying it's either illegal or it isn't, based on, does it create harm to the public? Even then you have a tricky regulatory question you're confronted with.
Yeah, so you talked about kind of different groups and how maybe technological innovation affects different groups. Dr. Thomas has another kind of philosophical big picture question. And she writes, in a sense, permissionless innovation is really just a form of democratic participation. It's a form of voice in a world in which expert regulators don't listen to practitioners and smaller producers' concerns as they design the rules of the game. Those small producers, therefore, have as their only choice to either evade or be quashed by regulation and never get off the ground. But doesn't that just move us a little bit closer to being just another banana republic in which government is in the pockets of the elites and large businesses and small producers and everyday people have to live in the reality of the informal economy as opposed to this regulatory state or hard law regulatory state? So put differently, is the rise of permissionless innovation maybe just a sign that our political system is falling apart and maybe illegitimate in the sense that it no longer allows a large portion of the population to participate in the formal economy?
So that's a wonderful question, Dr. Thomas. And I have a discussion about this in chapters 4, 5, 7, and 8 of the book. And specifically in chapter 4, I spent a lot of time talking about Albert Hirschman's old work on exit, voice, and loyalty. And I opened the book with a quote from Albert Hirschman in his book on exit, voice, and loyalty that says, exit has an essential role to play in restoring quality performance of government, just as in any organization. And again, that's the sort of sub-thesis of the book, which is evasive entrepreneurialism, technological civil disobedience, permissionless innovation are actually good for government because it forces us to recalibrate what we mean by the sort of consent of the governed and just common sense and good government. And I really believe that. I really believe we're not going towards a neo-anarchistic banana republic of underground trading and economy. Now, there are certain contexts where that happens, but I think innovation is changing the political dynamic in a positive way in many, but not all contexts. And in the book, I discuss this and specifically take on the really crucial question that was teed up by your question about, is this democratic governance? I spent an entire 2 chapters late in the book taking on my critics and other critics that emanate from the field of what's called RRI, Responsible Research and Innovation. It's what's called in Europe. Here, it doesn't use that moniker as much. We just talk about technology ethics and so on and so forth. But I've spent a lot of time with these folks, and they are extremely critical of permissionless innovation, evasive entrepreneurialism, and technological change for that matter. My bookshelf behind me there is just loaded with reams of books of people saying about how technology undermines our humanity and destroys our institutions, and more specifically, that technological change is not democratic. They say we need democratic processes to govern technological change, essentially political checks on forms of change. Now, practically speaking, you can just begin by pointing out all the public choice problems associated with that and the long histories that have been documented in those books I highlighted earlier about, innovation and its enemies and, the future and its enemies, and all the histories we have of how innovation was held up by politicians and elites because they just didn't like it and because they wanted to protect their own interest or their preferred status quo. And that's certainly still the case today, but technologies are helping us start to change that dynamic, I think, in positive ways. At least that's my hope. Again, I can't say that it's going to always work, but I'm pretty positive about this because I think the proof's in the pudding. And I think what I've seen in the fields that I've been covering for the last 30 years, and most specifically the emerging technologies I cover most closely in recent years, AI and autonomous systems, driverless cars, drones, sharing economy, 3D printing, virtual reality, things like this, cutting edge stuff. I'm seeing a lot of innovation happen. And despite all the talk about great stagnation and low-hanging fruit been picked that my colleagues like Tyler Cowan and others talk about, I always go around citing the opposite, citing all the wonderful examples of innovation happening in our midst, even despite the fact that law holds us back. It's my hope that the law and policy is recalibrated because of the pacing problem and the nature of technological change, and that does improve our institutions. Doesn't mean they're eliminated. I think that's wishful thinking by a lot of libertarian types, including a lot of my colleagues that I work with here at Mercatus. But I think that we've charted a different path now because of the fact that technology has opened up the door to new types of change. It has given us new forms of voice, and in some cases, even exit. And I would then therefore challenge the idea that it isn't democratic. It's when people act to create new tools and new methods to improve their lives, AKA technologies. What could be more democratic than that? They're actually acting together to find ways to better their lot in life or better the lives of their loved ones or their communities. That has a very democratic component to it. It's just not a political component or a regulatory one. But governance can take many different forms, and we can find alternative ways to govern the new emerging technologies we're talking about without it being a strict by the book command and control type regime like the past. So if nothing else, I try in the book to have an open dialogue with the responsible research and innovation movement and other technology critics and say, can you at least meet me halfway? Can you find a way to talk about governance more broadly other than strict top-down command and control type regulation? Can you think about it in these other terms and through other mechanisms or institutions in a sort of ostrom sense or something like that? And the answer is usually no, but I at least get a dialogue going with them, and I exploit the fact that they really cannot claim to be humanists if they're taking away our most fundamental human impulse to build new and better tools and methods to improve our lives. That's why I almost called this book Technological Humanism or Reclaiming Humanism, because all of my opponents self-label themselves humanists and assume that technological change and its defenders are anti-human. That's chapter 7 and 8 of the book if you want to read it, but I also have an article about this on Medium talking about what real technological humanism really means.
Great. So, I feel like we have to, when we're talking about technology and innovation, we have to kind of touch a little bit on kind of the critique or of kind of technological innovation, or at least your response to it. So, well, one thing I think about when it comes to innovation and this evasive entrepreneurship is this idea of voluntarism. So the virtue of markets largely stems from this idea of voluntarism, where people get together and exchange voluntarily, thus engaging in mutually beneficial exchanges or transactions, right? But with technology and rampant improvements in technology, which often include maybe getting more information from people, or perhaps making it so easy that people aren't necessarily engaged in voluntary transactions anymore, where, this idea of me, I have to use a cell phone, and I have to use particular sets of data, et cetera, to engage in transactions that aren't necessarily voluntary. And there's a lot of information asymmetries that come around from these new innovations. So what are the implications of evasive entrepreneurship in that sense?
So yeah, that's a great question, Kevin. I take that on at length in those chapters that I mentioned in the book, where I talk about humanism and responsible innovation and the critiques of technological change. And in fact, I'm going to pull from my shelf right here just to exemplify what you just said. Books with titles like How We're Re-Engineering Humanity and The Dangers of Voluntary Enslavement from being worshiping our technologies, and the fact that it becomes a dangerous master. I mean, this is the common critique that runs through most of the field of science and technology studies today, is that somehow technology is undermining our humanity, that it's changing us for the worse, that it's turning us into almost like slaves to the machine. And I don't buy that. I mean, if that was the case, then we got to just be advocating outright Luddism, and basically saying we should be smashing these machines. We should be stopping all forms of technological change. And of course, a lot of this is egged on by dystopian narratives emanating out of Hollywood or the press, that every single plot in a show or every single script or whatever else is just dripping with dystopian dread about the future, right? A world where technological change leaves us with just a living hellscape on Earth. And the problem is history. The problem is history tells us a very different story, which is that technological change and innovation is what lifted us up. It's what gave us our standard of living today. You can read Matt Ridley's new book on how innovation works that just came out this week, or read the work of Deirdre McCloskey on this, Joel McCurr on this. I mean, just an endless parade of historians of innovation and progress who've documented the fundamental role that technological change has played in lifting all boats and improving our humanity. And in one section of my book, I even talk about some forgotten work by some scholars who talked about how technology improves our humanity, if for no other reason than it opens up a new world. It makes visible to us the suffering of others and gives us a chance to change it. I mean, what were we to do about someone starving a world away or suffering 150 years ago when we couldn't even see it or know about it, except maybe many months removed, if at all? Now we see it instantaneously through modern information technologies, and we can instantaneously act to try to help. So in so many ways, technology broadens the horizons of our humanity and gives us new options of potential. That doesn't mean technology is always wonderful or good for us. And I spent a lot of time in my work, in both my last book on permissionless innovation, my new one on evasive entrepreneurialism, taking seriously the critiques of these techno-pessimists and critics who make these arguments. And I understand when they make complaints about, here's what technology means for privacy. Here's what it means for security. Here's what it means for child safety, whatever else. And I want to listen to those because there's a kernel of truth to all of those complaints. But my argument in each and every one of those cases is that the answer cannot be stop technology. It has to be embrace technology, but find better ways to address its downsides. And the responsibility that we have in our movement, for those of us who defend technological change and innovation, is to find ways to have that dialogue and to come up with constructive, bottom-up, flexible, adaptive governance mechanisms of a broader sense than just top-down regulation. That's why I use the term in the book, evasive entrepreneurialism and the future of governance. The future of governance is what I think a lot of folks in our movement don't spend enough time talking about. And instead they'll just say, privacy, you know, that issue, we'll get over it. That's not a big deal. Or safety issues, they're just cranks. They're just Luddites. No, that's not the way to have a dialogue with those folks. We need to find a way to open up a discussion about an alternative governance vision that allows technological change, but also addresses some of their very legitimate concerns about it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for joining us today. That brings us right to the end. His book Evasive Entrepreneurship is on Amazon and wherever else for sale. So definitely dive in and take a look at all of the chapters for a deeper dive into his thoughts on that. You know, we really appreciate you coming and joining us for this webinar series. I learned a whole lot, and I hope that our attendees also enjoyed it. And thank you so much for your questions. Outside of that, have a fantastic rest of the day. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.